The Great Party Switch Myth, Revisited. A history lesson for the people who had a liberal history teacher. Bieski's classroom. Here is a sentence that should not be able to be true at the same time. The party that founded the Ku Klux Klan is telling Black Americans it is their only protector. And yet, here we are. The story holding that contradiction together is called the Great Party Switch. It goes like this. Sometime around 1964, racist Southern Democrats magically became Republicans. Republicans absorbed all that Jim Crow enthusiasm, and everyone switched jerseys so completely that you never need to look at the actual historical record again. Clean, tidy. A neat ideological body swap that lets one party escape 200 years of documented atrocities and pin the blame on the other. I am a science teacher. When someone tells me the party switched, I have the same reaction a physics teacher has when a student insists the sun revolves around the earth. Not angry, just ready to walk through the evidence and explain exactly why the story does not match the data. This version goes deeper. Stay with me. The question nobody asks first. Before we talk about whether the party switched, we need to define the terms. Because this debate falls apart in the first 30 seconds when people use the word conservative as though it has some eternal fixed meaning. It does not. Conservative and progressive are directions, not identities. The direction only makes sense when you ask, moving away from what exactly? Elbridge Gerry was conservative. In 1812, Massachusetts governor, member of the Democratic-Republican Party, the direct genealogical ancestor of today's Democratic Party, same bloodline, unbroken, he signed a redistricting bill so contorted to protect his party that a cartoonist said the district looked like a salamander. Half Jerry, half salamander, gerrymander. That word exists because a member of the party that became the Democratic Party invented the concept in 1812. Jerry wanted to conserve the existing order of 1812 America, which included slavery, which his party defended through legislation, paramilitary violence, and eventually a 4-year secession war. The Federalists who opposed him were the progressives of that era, the ones who thought the status quo had problems worth fixing. This distinction is the foundation of everything else in this article. And here's where it gets interesting. The thing your history teacher never told you about big government. Republicans in the 1850s wanted strong, expansive federal government. Big, muscular, genuine, reach into the states. Why? Because you cannot end slavery without it. Slave states were not going to voluntarily free their enslaved people. Not in 1,000 years. You needed the federal government to overrule the states, to enforce constitutional amendments over the objections of state governments, to deploy troops to protect Black Americans from state-sponsored violence, to build a free labor economy through the Homestead Act and the Transcontinental Railroad, to hold the Union together by force when necessary. Big government was the abolitionist tool. Republicans wanted it because the threat required it. Now flip it. Democrats in the same era wanted small federal government, weak, limited, states deciding for themselves without Washington's interference. Why? Because you cannot keep slavery with a strong federal government watching. States' rights was never a philosophical position. It was a tactical shield. Democrats needed weak federal authority because strong federal power meant the feds could abolish slavery, protect freed slaves from state violence, send troops to enforce court orders, and dismantle every mechanism of racial control that Democratic state governments had constructed. The Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision in 1857, a Democrat-appointed Supreme Court majority ruling that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. All of it was the Democratic Party working to prevent federal authority from growing powerful enough to touch their institution. Small government was the pro-slavery tool. Democrats wanted it because the alternative ended everything they had built. Now here's the part the left does not want you to put together. Today, Republicans want limited federal government. The left says this proves the party switched. What they're actually saying, without realizing it, is that a tool which was once used for liberation cannot also be used for liberation in a different context. But consider why Republicans want limited government now. It is not because they abandoned their abolitionist roots. It is because the mechanism of control changed. Slavery was never about race. It was always about this. I need to stop here and say something that most history teachers never say out loud. The first coerced labor force in what became the United States was not African, it was white. English, Irish, Scottish, indentured servants, many transported against their will, sold for terms of years, subjected to brutal conditions, bought and sold like property. The Irish arrived in the Caribbean and colonial Virginia in large numbers during the 1640s and 1650s, under conditions historians describe as functionally indistinguishable from chattel slavery. Virginia, in the early and mid-1600s, had more white coerced laborers than black ones. Race-based hereditary chattel slavery was not the starting point. It was the upgrade. The planter class had a business problem with white servants. They were temporary. Serve your term, walk free, blend back into the population. Hard to identify at a distance, hard to recapture when they ran. The labor supply kept running out. Race-based hereditary slavery solved both problems. Make it racial, and the identification problem disappears. A person of African descent could not vanish into the colonial white population. Make it hereditary, and the supply problem disappears. The labor force reproduces itself. No more import costs. A self-sustaining, perpetually captive workforce, legally defined as property, with no pathway to freedom. Slavery was never primarily about race. It was about power, wealth extracted from a captive population, with no political voice and no means of escape. Race was the technology used to make that extraction permanent. The planters were not primarily racists. They were capitalists of the most brutal kind, and race-based hereditary slavery was the most efficient business model available to them. This matters enormously, because if slavery was about power, not race, then its modern successor follows the same logic, and you do not need to target one race to run it. More on that in a moment. But first, I need to show you how badly your textbook lied to you about the scale of this institution, what the textbook got wrong. Most Americans believe the United States was the primary destination for enslaved Africans. That picture, planted by decades of United States-centric textbooks, media, and political discourse, is wrong by a factor of 10. Here are the actual numbers from the Slave Voyages database, the most comprehensive academic record of the transatlantic slave trade. Approximately 10.7 million enslaved Africans survived the Middle Passage to the Americas between 1525 and 1866. Brazil received approximately 4.8 to 5 million. About 45 to 50% of the total. The Caribbean received approximately 4 to 5 million more, another 40%. The future United States received approximately 388,000 to 450,000, roughly 4 to 6%. Brazil received 10 times more enslaved people than the United States. The Caribbean received roughly the same. And yet, Americans, because their textbooks told them to, walk around believing the United States was the central story of a global institution that, in raw numbers, overwhelmingly happened somewhere else. In 2015, McGraw-Hill published a world geography textbook used in Texas high schools with a caption implying the slave trade brought millions of workers to the southern United States. Workers, not slaves, and primarily to the United States, both wrong at the same time. The backlash forced a revision, but the students who learned from those books kept the misconception. James Lowen analyzed 12 of the most widely used high school United States history textbooks in Lies My Teacher Told Me, and found that virtually all of them centered the American experience so completely that students came away believing the United States was the central story. A 2019 Washington Post poll found only 25% of Americans could correctly identify even basic factual parameters of American slavery, let alone its place in the global picture. Why does this matter for the party switch debate? Because inflating America's role in the transatlantic trade, making slavery seem uniquely American, uniquely racial, uniquely tied to current American politics, is exactly the kind of distortion that makes the great party switch myth feel intuitive. If slavery was an American invention rooted in racial animus, then the party that defended it must have eventually become the racist party, by definition. But slavery was a global economic institution that existed in virtually every civilization in human history. Ancient Rome, Greece, Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and the American version was built on the same logic of economic power, not racial ideology. Race was the upgrade, not the origin. The textbook got the numbers wrong. It got the racial origins wrong. Every single error happens to make the myth more plausible. Whether that is incompetence or curriculum design is a question I leave to you. The Republican Party was built for a reason. March 20th, 1854. Ripon, Wisconsin. Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas had just pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress, repealing the Missouri Compromise and opening previously free territories to slavery's potential expansion. The Whig Party collapsed under the political weight of trying to straddle the issue. Out of that collapse came a new coalition with one explicit purpose: stop slavery from spreading. Day one, founding purpose: In 1860, Lincoln, Republican, wins the presidency. South Carolina secedes before he is even inaugurated. Let that land. They did not wait to see what he would do. They left the country because a Republican was elected. The entire Confederacy was a preemptive defensive reaction to the Republican Party's existence. 1865, 13th Amendment, abolishes slavery. Unanimous Republican support. Democrats, minimal. 1868, 14th Amendment, equal protection. Birthright citizenship. Republicans. 1870, 15th Amendment, voting rights regardless of race. Republicans. Again, during Reconstruction, with federal enforcement active, approximately 2,000 black men served in elected office across the South. 16 black Republicans served in Congress between 1870 and 1901. Senator Hiram Rhodes, Revolves of Mississippi, became the first black United States senator in 1870. Joseph Rainey of South Carolina became the first black United States representative. Every single one, Republican. Democrats responded with the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, and the Red Shirts. Organized paramilitary groups that lynched black voters, burned Republican polling places, and murdered Republican office holders. Historian Eric Foner described the early Ku Klux Klan as a military force serving the interests of the Democratic Party. When Reconstruction ended and federal troops withdrew, Democratic Redeemer governments retook Southern legislatures and spent the next 90 years building Jim Crow. How Democrats stole back what Republicans had won. People who push the party switch often ask, if black voters were all Republicans, why did they eventually leave? Fair question, but the answer destroys the myth. Black voters did not leave the Republican Party because Republicans became racist. Black voters lost the right to vote because Democrats used organized violence to take it from them. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction by removing the last federal troops from the South. That one political deal handed Democratic Redeemer governments the key they needed. What followed was not a political realignment. It was a campaign of terror. Democrats deployed the Mississippi Plan, organized intimidation, economic coercion, and outright violence at polling places, not to convince black citizens to vote differently, but to prevent them from voting at all. White League paramilitaries murdered black Republican leaders. Polling places were surrounded by armed men. Landlords threatened eviction for anyone who showed up to vote. The message was not, switch parties. It was, try to vote and die. Then came the legislative dismantlement. Democratic state legislatures enacted literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all facially neutral, all surgically engineered to eliminate black voters specifically. The numbers are devastating. In Louisiana, black voter registration stood at 130,344 in 1896. By 1900, 5,320 in 4 years. Mississippi, 52,705 in 1876. By 1898, 3,573. That is not a preference change. That is a voter elimination campaign. The black political participation collapse after 1877 is evidence of what Democratic-controlled state governments did when federal protection disappeared, not evidence that black voters chose to change allegiance. The people being killed and disenfranchised were trying to remain Republican. Democrats made sure they could not. The Republican Party's failure here was real. National Republicans lost the political will to enforce the amendments they had passed, and that failure enabled what came next. But the atrocity was committed by Democrats, and it held for nearly 90 years, until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, passed by Republicans at a higher percentage than Democrats, finally restored what a century of Democratic governance had destroyed. Little Rock, 1957. Still the same pattern. Fast forward to 1957. Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 black students attempt to enroll following the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education ruling. Governor Orval Faubus, Democrat, ordered the Arkansas National Guard to physically block the students, defied federal court orders, used armed state force to prevent constitutional rights from being exercised. Won multiple re-election campaigns by appealing to the segregationist voters. This standoff energized, never switched parties. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Republican, federalized the Arkansas National Guard, removing it from Faubus's control, then deployed the 101st Airborne Division, approximately 1,000 federal troops, to protect the students and enforce the court's ruling. Mob rule cannot be allowed to override the decisions of the courts. One of the strongest federal civil rights interventions of the decade by a Republican against Democratic obstruction. 7 years before the Civil Rights Act, same pattern as Reconstruction. Republican federal power protecting Black Americans from Democratic state-level resistance. If the parties had switched by 1957, someone needs to explain that. 1964. The year the myth says everything flipped. Civil Rights Act of 1964. House, Republicans, yes, at 80%. Democrats, yes, at 61%. Senate, Republicans, yes, at 82%. Democrats, yes, at 69%. The Republican Party voted for the Civil Rights Act at a higher percentage than the Democratic Party. At the exact moment the switch is supposed to have happened, the 75-day Senate filibuster was led by Democrats, specifically Robert Byrd of West Virginia, not a casual Klan member. A recruiter who personally organized a chapter of 150 men. He filibustered for 14 consecutive hours against giving Black Americans the protections they had been promised since 1865. He died a United States Senator in 2010. His Democratic colleagues called him the conscience of the Senate. 2 Democratic presidents eulogized him. He never switched parties. He was never asked to explain those 14 hours. The conscience of the Democratic Senate. A man who organized a Ku Klux Klan chapter and filibustered civil rights for 14 hours. I need that sentence to sit there. To believe this myth, here is everything you have to ignore. A hypothesis requiring you to ignore the data is not a hypothesis. It is a story. You would have to ignore the Republican Party being founded in 1854 to oppose slavery, not to evolve toward that position over decades, day one, by abolitionists. You would have to ignore 2,000 Black Republican office holders during Reconstruction and the organized Democratic paramilitary violence used to end their participation. Every Black elected official of that era was a Republican. Democrats ended that chapter with rifles and rope. You would have to ignore the Civil Rights Act voting records. 80% Republican support versus 61% Democratic in the House. The numbers are in the congressional record. Anyone can look them up. You would have to ignore that almost no prominent segregationists actually changed parties. Strom Thurmond switched in 1964. He is famous precisely because he was the exception. Robert Byrd, Ku Klux Klan recruiter and 14-hour filibusterer, died a celebrated Democrat in 2010. George Wallace, who declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, at his 1963 Democratic inaugural address, never switched. Al Gore Sr. voted against the Civil Rights Act and stayed a Democrat. The mass exodus the myth requires never happened. If it had, there would be dozens of famous examples. There is one. You would have to ignore the Louisiana and Mississippi voter registration collapse. 130,344 Black voters in Louisiana in 1896, down to 5,320 by 1900, not because they changed their minds, but because Democrats used violence and law to strip them of the franchise entirely. You would have to ignore Barry Goldwater, who the myth casts as the racist Southern strategy launcher. The same Barry Goldwater who helped found the Arizona NAACP chapter, who desegregated the Arizona Air National Guard 2 years before Truman integrated the military, who voted for the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960. His opposition to 2 specific titles of the 1964 Act was constitutional, not racial, and he later called it one of his greatest regrets. A man who built an NAACP chapter is not the racist conversion story the myth needs him to be. You would have to ignore that Nixon did not win the Deep South in 1968. George Wallace, Democrat, explicit segregationist, swept it. Nixon's share of Deep South white voters was 29%. Wallace had 63%. If the Southern strategy was pulling Southern racists into the Republican Party, Nixon would have won those states. He did not. You would have to ignore air conditioning. Widespread, affordable air conditioning arrived in the early 1950s, ended the climate barrier that had kept Northern industry and population out of the South, and brought Northern Republicans with it. Political scientists have documented it. The fastest Republican gains in the South correlated directly with the highest rates of Northern in-migration. The South did not convert its Democrats. It imported Republicans from Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. You would have to ignore that Southern congressional seats stayed overwhelmingly Democratic for decades after 1964. Georgia did not elect a Republican governor until 2002, 38 years after the supposed overnight switch. You would have to ignore the peer-reviewed research by political scientists Schaefer and Johnston, who analyzed decades of Southern election data and concluded class and economics, not racial resentment, were the primary drivers. Upper-income suburban whites moved Republican for tax and economic reasons. Working-class whites stayed democratic longer. Normal, class-based political sorting in a modernizing economy. You would have to ignore what Lyndon Johnson said privately. Documented by his own biographers, Robert Caro and Robert Dallek, neither of them conservative, including calling the Civil Rights Act by a racial slur in conversations with segregationist senators, and telling aide Bill Moyers the night he signed it, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." Cold political calculation, not moral triumph. You would have to ignore all of that simultaneously without a single primary source to justify it. In my classroom, that earns a failing grade on the hypothesis test. The new plantation. Here is where the ideology section we started with comes full circle. The old model of slavery ended legally in 1865. Republicans forced that through over Democratic resistance. So the Democratic Party had a problem. Its method of control was now unconstitutional. What came next? You cannot import enslaved people anymore, but you can manufacture a dependent population in place. You can build financial structures that trap people at the bottom of the economic ladder and make climbing out the irrational choice. You do not need to own people when you control their food, their housing, their school, and their sense of who their enemies are. In 1965, before the Great Society programs fully took hold, roughly 80 to 85% of Black children in America were raised in two-parent households. A community that had survived slavery, the Black Codes, Jim Crow, and a century of organized terror maintained stronger family cohesion than most of the country. Then came the welfare architecture. Benefits that disappeared when a recipient married, single-parent households receiving more assistance, the federal government structurally incentivizing single parenthood and penalizing family formation. Nobody had to write Black families must break up into the statute. They just had to make it the financially rational choice. Today, fewer than 30% of Black children are raised in two-parent households. Out-of-wedlock births went from 21% in 1965 to over 77% today. 200 years of slavery did not break the Black family. Jim Crow did not break it. Democratic welfare policy did it in one generation. Stack the minimum wage on top of that. Invented, and this is documented history, not opinion, by progressive eugenicists in the early 20th century, specifically to price Black workers, immigrants, and disabled people out of the labor market. Thomas Leonard at Princeton spent a career on this. Union leaders of that era stated it plainly. Wage floors removed the incentive for employing the Negro. The Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 was pushed by Southern Democrats to protect white union workers from Black competition. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 excluded agricultural and domestic workers, where Black labor was concentrated in the Jim Crow South, because Southern Democrats demanded those exclusions as the price of their votes. Milton Friedman called the minimum wage the most anti-Negro law on our statute books in 1966. Same law, same party, rebranded as racial justice. The dependency loop is elegant in its cruelty. Minimum wage prices low-skill workers out of entry-level employment. Those workers qualify for welfare. Welfare benefits shrink as earned income rises, making taking a job the financially irrational choice. Those people vote reliably for the party, protecting their benefits. Democrats deliver. Dependency deepens. Votes lock in. On the old plantation, they harvested cotton. On the new plantation, they harvest ballots. The projects are the quarters. HUD is the overseer. The welfare check that vanishes the moment you marry is the pass system. The school district fighting school choice is the law against teaching slaves to read. Different infrastructure, identical architecture of control. And here is the thing about this model that proves slavery was never about race. Look at the welfare trap in rural Appalachia. White communities, same structural dependency, same generational poverty, same political calculation. Keep them poor. Keep them afraid. Keep them voting for whoever promises to protect the check. The Democratic Party's operating model does not require a specific race. It requires a specific condition: dependency. Race just makes it harder to escape because racial identity can be weaponized to keep people voting for the party that claims to protect them against the very people who've been trying to expand school choice and eliminate welfare marriage penalties for decades. This is not a metaphor. This is the operating model of a party that has never once, in its entire 200-year existence, needed the communities it claims to champion to actually thrive. So when Republicans today want limited federal government, it is not a betrayal of their abolitionist roots. It is the same ideology applied to the current threat. When the mechanism of enslavement was a private institution protected by state governments, you needed federal power to override it. When the mechanism of enslavement is the federal government running a dependency machine, you limit federal power to dismantle it. Same purpose, different tool, because the threat changed. The Democratic Party wanted small government when federal power threatened slavery. They want big government now because the federal dependency machine is their plantation. The size preference flipped. The operating model is maintain a dependent underclass, keep them reliant on whatever the party controls, collect their loyalty at the ballot box, has not moved an inch in 200 years. Quinn's first law, liberalism always generates the exact opposite of its stated intent. The policy sold as compassion produced the most dramatic institutional collapse in modern American demographic history. And the party responsible blamed the collapse on systemic racism, on the Southern strategy. Yes, it existed. Nixon and Reagan made appeals to conservative Southern voters on states' rights, law and order, anti-busing sentiment. Real, documented. What I will not accept is the leap from Republicans courted Southern conservative voters to Republicans absorbed all the racism while Democrats became saints. Start with Goldwater, since his 1964 campaign is cited as the racist launch. This is the man who helped found the Arizona NAACP chapter, who desegregated the Arizona Air National Guard 2 years before Truman integrated the military, who voted for the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960. His opposition to 2 titles of the 1964 Act was constitutional, federal authority over private businesses. And he later called it a regret. He was the Southern strategy's supposed origin point, a man with a stronger personal civil rights record than most Northern liberals of his era. Nixon won the suburban peripheral South. Virginia, Tennessee, Florida, the Carolinas, areas with economic growth, Northern transplant communities, and professional classes moving Republican on tax and governance grounds. Wallace swept the hardcore Deep South, with 63% of white voters to Nixon's 29%. If a racist vacuum was pulling segregationists into the Republican Party, Nixon would have won those states. He finished a distant second to the Democrat in them. The Schaefer-Johnston peer-reviewed research is definitive. Class and economics, not racial resentment, drove the Southern realignment. Upper-income suburban whites moved Republican on economic grounds. Working-class whites stayed Democratic longer. And one more thing about states' rights. I established at the beginning of this article that Democrats used it as a tactical shield for slavery. When conservatives invoke it today, they're making a constitutional argument about the 10th Amendment, enumerated powers, and spending levels. Those positions share 3 words and nothing else. Conflating them because the vocabulary overlaps is the analytical equivalent of noting that fire trucks and fire share a word, and concluding fire trucks cause fires. The Southern strategy explains some voter movement in some states. It does not change the Civil Rights Act percentages. It does not unfilibuster Robert Byrd. It does not explain black voters shifting Democratic in the 1930s. It is one piece of the puzzle, held up as the entire puzzle by people who need you to stop looking at the rest. Quinn's second law. If you want to know what liberals are doing, watch what they accuse conservatives of. They invented gerrymandering and scream about gerrymandering. They built the dependency trap and lecture about systemic poverty. They ran the Ku Klux Klan and call everyone else racist. The projection is so consistent it has become their political identity. One last question. Which American cities have been governed entirely by Democrats for the last 50 years? Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, Newark, Cleveland, St. Louis, Oakland. Generational poverty. Catastrophic graduation rates. Some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country. Worst income inequality in the developed world. Schools so comprehensively failed that the party running them fights school choice at every turn because the union writes the check and the kids can stay in the building. The Democratic Party has controlled every one of those cities. Every school board, every mayor, every police department, every economic development decision. 50 uncontested years in the communities they claim most loudly to champion. Look at what they built. A party that genuinely transformed into the champion of those communities would have something to show for 50 uncontested years of running the experiment. The response to catastrophic outcomes under Democratic governance is always more of the identical policy that produced them, plus accusations of racism against whoever reads the data out loud. Look at today. And then tell me the parties switched. You want modern evidence? Fine. Let us look at right now. The minimum wage. Invented, as I documented above, by progressive eugenicists and pushed by unions specifically to price black workers out of the labor market, is still being championed by the Democratic Party, whose single largest voting bloc is, and has been for decades, organized labor. The same institution that fought to keep black workers unemployable a century ago is still writing Democratic campaign checks. The policy instrument designed to remove the incentive for employing the Negro is still on the platform. Still, in 2026. Rebranded as economic justice. On April 29th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in Louisiana versus Calais that states cannot sort voters into congressional districts based primarily on race. The court held that minority voters are entitled to nothing less and nothing more than what race-neutral criteria produce. That is equality. Colorblind. Constitutional. Democrats melted down. Representative Stansbury went on camera with flags and a pained expression to announce that the Supreme Court had gutted enforcement of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Obama posted that the ruling allowed legislatures to systematically dilute the voting power of racial minorities. Neither of them cited a single sentence of the actual 51-page opinion, because the opinion says the opposite of what they claimed, what they were really saying. And I need you to hear what is underneath their words, is that without race-based sorting, without government officials drawing geographic boxes to concentrate black voters and deliver those boxes to Democratic incumbents, black Americans cannot have their voices heard. That is their argument. Stated plainly, black voters need white Democratic politicians to manage their political geography for them. Otherwise, chaos. That is not protection. That is the plantation with better optics. And here is the part that should make your jaw drop. The word gerrymandering, the very concept they are accusing the court of enabling, was invented by a Democratic Republican governor in 1812. The man who invented the practice of sorting voters into politically engineered districts was the political ancestor of today's Democratic Party. They are now on camera weeping about a ruling that prohibits the thing their party invented. I keep expecting to see some self-awareness. I keep being disappointed. It is exactly like the old segregated South defending separate drinking fountains. The argument then was, these arrangements protect black communities. The argument now is, race-sorted districts protect black communities. The mechanism is the same. The paternalism is the same. The belief that black Americans cannot function in a system that treats them equally, that they need managed spaces designed for them by the party that knows better, is identical. The only thing that changed is the venue. It went from water fountains to congressional maps. Meanwhile, the Congressional Black Caucus, the caucus that exists specifically to advocate for black constituents, denied membership to Steve Cohen, the congressman representing Tennessee's 9th District in Memphis, a majority black district. Black voters went to the polls, exercised their sacred democratic right, and elected Cohen to represent them. The Congressional Black Caucus said no, not because of his positions, because he is white. The black voters of Memphis made the wrong choice, and the Congressional Black Caucus, entirely controlled by Democrats, punished them for it. That is, Democrats telling black voters their votes only count if they vote correctly. That is the plantation. With a press release, now, Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood with an explicit goal of reducing the birth rates of populations she described as genetically inferior. She spoke to Ku Klux Klan women's chapters. She used the word human weeds for the communities she targeted. Today, Planned Parenthood clinics are disproportionately located in black and minority communities, not because of a conventional business plan, but as a direct continuation of Sanger's founding mission. Black Americans have the highest abortion rate of any demographic group in the country by a significant margin. The organization whose founder explicitly wanted to reduce black birth rates is disproportionately serving black communities. And the Democratic Party defends its funding in every single budget cycle while claiming to be the champion of black America. You cannot make this up. Now, the hardest number in this entire article. The one the Democratic Party prays you never connect to the cities they have governed for 50 years. Black Americans represent approximately 13 to 14% of the United States population. They account for roughly 50 to 60% of homicide victims nationally. In the cities at the top of the homicide rankings: St. Louis, Baltimore, Detroit, Memphis, New Orleans, Birmingham, Jackson. Black residents make up the overwhelming majority of victims. 27 of the top 30 highest homicide cities in the country are governed by Democratic mayors. Not because most large cities happen to have Democratic mayors, though that is also true, but because the cities with the worst outcomes for black Americans, specifically, are the ones that have been run by Democrats the longest and most completely. Sean Hannity and other conservative commentators scroll the names of black homicide victims regularly, their names, their faces, acknowledging that they existed and that their deaths matter. Where are the Democrats? Where are the memorials, the ads, the press conferences? Where is the party that claims the great party switch happened and they are now the protectors of Black America? Where are they on the specific, measurable, ongoing catastrophe happening in the cities they govern? I will tell you where they were. When homicide rates spiked after 2020, Democratic city governments across the country moved to defund the police. In the cities with the highest Black homicide rates, defund the police. The boat is sinking. They look you in the eye and tell you they care about you. Then they get in the life raft, take all the buckets with them, and surround themselves with private security. If Black lives matter, and they do, every single one of them, then why do they only seem to matter when there is a political narrative attached? Why are conservative commentators the ones scrolling names? Why does the party that supposedly transformed into the champion of Black America respond to record Black homicide rates in its own cities by removing the people standing between those communities and the violence? Why? Because Black homicide victims in Democratic cities do not serve the narrative. A crime statistic in Chicago does not generate the right kind of outrage. It points in the wrong direction. You want to tell me the party switched? Fine. Then explain the minimum wage. Explain Louisiana versus Calais and the Democratic reaction to colorblind equality. Explain the Congressional Black Caucus turning away the voters of Memphis. Explain the Planned Parenthood clinic placement strategy. Explain 27 of 30 highest homicide cities with Democratic mayors. Explain 50 years of uncontested Democratic governance producing the worst outcomes for Black Americans in the country. Explain defunding the police in those same cities. Explain all of it with primary sources. I will wait. Because the party that switched to championing Black America should be able to show something, anything, from the communities it has governed unchallenged for half a century. Bluthersnatch. The parties did not swap souls in the 1960s. What happened was a geographic and class realignment over decades, driven by industrialization, air conditioning, northern in-migration, and the natural sorting of voters by economic interest and ideology. So gradual that Georgia did not elect a Republican governor until 2002, not exactly the overnight body swap story. The Republican Party absorbed the economic conservatism of a modernizing Sunbelt region largely populated by northern transplants. Its preference for limited federal government today is the same ideology applied to a change threat. When the oppressor was a private institution protected by state governments, you used federal power to dismantle it. When the oppressor is the federal government running a dependency machine, you limit it instead. The purpose never changed. The tool required did. The Democratic Party found a newer, more defensible mechanism for the same 200-year operating model. From Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, through Andrew Jackson's expansion of the slave empire and destruction of native nations, through the Confederate secession, through the Ku Klux Klan, through Woodrow Wilson resegregating the federal workforce in 1913, through Robert Byrd's filibuster in 1964, through Lyndon Johnson's Great Society architecture that traded the cotton plantation for the housing project. The instrument changed every generation. The orchestra never did. The myth exists for one purpose. Give the party with that unbroken 200-year record a get-out-of-jail-free card and transfer the blame to the party founded specifically to end it. The primary sources do not agree. The voting records do not agree. The demographic data do not agree. The family stability numbers do not agree. The economic outcomes in 50 years of Democratic-governed cities do not agree. The myth agrees with itself. That is all it has ever done. If this article made you think, like this article so the algorithm shows it to people who need to see it. Share this. Every share reaches new eyes. Use it. Comment below with your take. Which section are you using the next time someone throws the party switch at you? Which part changed how you see it? Tell me. I read every reply. And if you want more of this, the data, the history, the science, the stories, join Pski's classroom community or follow me on YouTube. Even better, subscribe to my account. About the cost of a cup of coffee per month. That is it. Your support keeps this classroom open, and I promise I will never run out of material as long as the left keeps trying to outdumb itself. But what do I know? I am only a science teacher who has spent 16 plus years assigning primary sources to teenagers, who knows the textbook gets the slave trade wrong by a factor of 10, who watched Democrats cry about colorblind equality while governing the most dangerous cities for Black Americans in the country, and who has been watching the new plantation operate in real communities with real families long enough to stop calling it a policy failure and start calling it what it is.